Today we're going to turn a cinder block into a nightstand, and I'm even going to make a solid tin Mandolorian handle. I've been a fan of bespoke posts for quite some time. I've just always gotten such cool little staging items from them. So when they sent me these recent boxes which contained this really cool concrete lantern slash hand heater and this rustic looking hunting knife, I decided to make a small furniture piece that could store and display them. We're going to start by coating the cinder block or concrete masonry unit with a few coats of Limestrong Plaster. I've been interested in Limestrong products for a while, and this project is the perfect place to test out their sample kits. I mixed the plaster with water and then applied it to the cinder block with a putty knife. The flat surfaces were really easy. The only tricky parts were the corners and the curved interior parts of the block. My sister Jessie suggested using a silicone spatula to apply the plaster around the edges and inside radiuses, and this was a great idea. It worked so much better than the rigid putty knife. I let the plaster cure for 24 hours and then used a putty knife to scrape off any little uneven parts. I then sanded it with 150 grit sandpaper. I'm not trying to perfectly flatten out the surfaces, just take down the high points and get it all ready for a second and final coat. I wiped off the dust and then mixed up another batch of the Limestrong plaster and applied a final coat. The first coat had smoothed out a lot of the rough texture on the cinder block, so this second coat went on way easier. I let this coat cure for 2 days and then sanded it with these sanding screens. This works much better than sandpaper, and these are just screens that are typically used for sanding drywall. The plaster can be sealed with an olive oil soap mixture that they also provide in the kit. You just dilute it with some water and then brush it on. Now I also wanted to test out a few alternatives to this Limestrong plaster, which is a specialty product. At first I tried Fusion Pro Grout. It went on okay and it certainly bonded really well to the concrete, but I just felt like you didn't get quite the control that I wanted, and it's very difficult to sand. Next I tried Joint Compound, which is used for blending the seams on panels of drywall. This was really easy, and this gypsum plaster is quite soft, so it's super easy to sand. The downside is this gypsum plaster is not nearly as hard or as strong as the Limestrong plaster, and definitely needs to be painted. For the door, I'm going to use a scrap piece of Cumaru decking. This is a really hard and dense tropical hardwood, but I really like the color. I just traced the outline of the cinder block opening and then cut the piece out with my jigsaw. This scrap piece had been sitting in a pile for a while and was pretty beat up, so I definitely had to do a bit of sanding, starting with 100 grit and then working my way up to 220 grit. Now because this wood is so dense and has a lot of oil already in it, I had to use a specialty Ipe oil, which is formulated for tropical hardwoods like this. I wanted the door to sit inside the masonry frame, and I didn't want to really use a hinge. I just thought it would take up too much room and be too clunky. So I decided to do a magnet detail, and I just used my palm router to recess a cavity into the wood that would hold a rare earth magnet. Now these magnets are quite strong, so in order to really secure it into the wood, I used Gorilla 2-part epoxy and used a small piece of fabric over the top as sort of a fiber reinforced band-aid to help hold it all in and also disperse the epoxy. Now I just need a surface for the magnet to stick to, so I got a scrap piece of angle steel and cut it to fit inside the cavity with my angle grinder. This vise that I got from Garrett Wade sure comes in handy for projects like this. Be sure to check it out. There's a link to it in the description box below. The cut edges were a bit rough and also the steel was rusty, so I just cleaned it all up with a flap disc. I'm going to glue the steel to the cinder block using anchoring epoxy, but I drilled some holes in the steel just to give the epoxy a place to go through and so it can kind of wrap all the way around the steel. This Quikrete anchoring epoxy is ridiculously strong. I've used it to anchor down the container house and all sorts of industrial projects. It has this mixing nozzle so it mixes the two parts as you squirt it, and I just applied some to the cinder block, placed the steel, saw that the epoxy was pushing up through the holes, and then added a little bit more on the top. Now here's the fun part. We're going to make some solid tin and bismuth cabinet pulls using silicone ice cube molds that I got off of Amazon. I'll put links to all this stuff in the description. I want to embed these bolts into the molten metal, but I don't want to sink too far, and I also want it to stay straight and upright. So I drilled some holes in popsicle sticks and used a nut to set them into the right location. I'm using a lead-free alloy made of tin and bismuth that melts at just around 280 degrees Fahrenheit. I got this handy little melting pot also from Amazon that you just plug right in, wait about 5 to 10 minutes for it to heat up, and then you can just watch it melt rather quickly. I poured the molten tin into the molds and then placed the bolts. I let the tin cool off for a couple hours and then popped them right out of the mold. Each time I've done this, I've gotten a slightly different patina on the tin. I don't know if it's just contamination in the mold or some sort of oil from my hands on them, but it all kind of looks cool. If you don't like the patina though, you can just brush it right off with a Scotch pad and it'll be nice and shiny. I drilled a hole through the front face of the door, flipped the door over, and drilled a slightly larger hole just so I could recess the nut. Now, before I show you how I modified this Boba Fett helmet into a Mandalorian helmet, let's hear a word from our sponsor. Bespoke Post is a monthly membership club delivering awesome boxes of top-shelf goods from under-the-radar brands for every part of your life. From home and bar to outdoor gear, style picks, and more, each themed box is packed with over $70 of value, plus useful advice to help you set up your life every month, all while discovering cool new products and emerging brands. I absolutely love the last two boxes that I got. One of them had this really cool mini flicker fireplace that's way more awesome than any candle. You just add some rubbing alcohol and then light it with the long matches provided, and you have a mini fireplace within minutes out of the box. I also got a Buck and Bear Mini Hunter Damascus steel knife featuring a drop point blade with 256 layers of forged steel. It has full tang construction and a gorgeous wood handle fastened with brass pins. It's a great looking understated classic knife that I'm sure will get a lot of use around Maker Ranch. To get your own Bespoke Post boxes, click on the link in the description box below and use the promo code HOMEMADE to get 20% off your first box. You can discover cool products and brands, find something new every month, and you have flexibility. If you want to skip a month, return or exchange a box, pause your subscription, cancel altogether, no sweat. So don't forget the promo code HOMEMADE to get 20% off your first box. Go click on that link in the description, and that'll take you to a short quiz that'll allow Bespoke Post to tailor the boxes to your interests. All right, back to the build. Now, many hardcore Star Wars fans will tell you that Boba Fett is the one that has that little scope on the side of his helmet, and that the main character in The Mandalorian doesn't have one of those. Now, these are Boba Fett molds, but no problem. I just used my Ryobi rotary tool to grind off the little antenna. I started with a carving attachment to remove most of the material, and then switched to a grinding stone to smooth it all out. Now, if melting metal is a little bit too intimidating, you can use these same silicone molds to make concrete cabinet pulls, which are quite rugged. I'm using white Quikrete countertop mix, but any basic concrete mix will work. Just add water, mix it up, pour it into the mold, try to vibrate out as many bubbles as possible, and then once again just use the popsicle sticks and bolts to create a secure way to mount these cabinet pulls. Now, remember those single cinder blocks that I coated in different types of plaster? Well, I wanted to use those too, but by themselves they're kind of short. So I decided to make a stand using some scrap pieces of cedar 2x6s. I just freehand drew out an outline and then cut the pieces with my jigsaw. I sanded the pieces and rounded over the sharp edges just to give them a more organic look. I used finished screws to screw them together and then covered up the screw heads with wood putty. I sanded down the putty and then painted both the wood and the cinder block with Rust-Oleum chalked paint in linen white. This is just a super matte paint that I'm really digging these days. I used the Quikrete anchoring epoxy to secure the cinder block to the wooden stand. I decided to lean into this sort of cartoon alien aesthetic and painted the inside of the block with a bright yellow house paint. I love quick and easy DIY projects like this that can take advantage of any sort of leftover scraps you have from various projects. I mean, we used the leftover cinder blocks, some scraps of 2x6, some drywall mud that was left from the container house, and turned it into something, well, maybe not super practical, but certainly fun and reasonably useful. This nightstand, however, I am super proud of. I really think it has the classic Star Wars aesthetic where it mixes in plaster textures with real wood and patinaed metal. I also just really enjoyed seeing such an easily recognizable thing as a cinder block coated in a totally different surface texture. I mean, I've always thought of cinder blocks as a little bit on the ugly side, but once you coat them in a smooth plaster, they take on a whole different look and feel. Don't forget to click the link in the description to check out Bespoke Post, and also don't forget that promo code, HOMEMADE, to get 20% off your first box. Check out some of our other videos, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Thanks!